The 6 members of the Moore family and 2 guests were found bludgeoned to death in the Moore's residence. All 8 victims, including 6 children, had severe head wounds from an axe. On June 9th, 1912, Mary Moore, who was 10 years old, invited Ina May, who was 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, who was 12, to spend the night at the Moore's residence. That same evening, the visiting girls in the Moore family attended the Presbyterian Church evening service. Afterwards, the Moores and the Stillinger sisters walked to the Moore's house, arriving between 9:45 and 10 p.m. At 7 a.m. the next day, June 10th, Mary Peckham, the Moore's neighbor, became concerned after she noticed the family had not come out to do their morning chores. Peckham knocked on the Moore's door. When nobody answered, she tried the door, but it was locked. Peckham let the Moore's chickens out and then called Ross Moore, Josiah Moore's brother. Like Peckham, Moore received no response when he knocked on the door. Ross unlocked the front door with his copy of the house key. While Peckham stood on the porch, Ross went into the parlor and opened the guest bedroom door, where he found the Stillinger sisters' bodies on the bed. Moore immediately told Peckham to call Henry Hank Horton, Villisca's primary peace officer, who arrived shortly thereafter. Horton's search of the house revealed that the entire Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls had been bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon, an axe belonging to the Moores. It was found in the guest room with the Stillinger sisters. Doctors concluded that the murders had taken place between midnight and 5 a.m. 2 spent cigarettes in the attic suggested that the killer potentially waited in the attic until the Moore family and the Stillinger guests were asleep. The killer began in the master bedroom, where the parents, Josiah and Sarah Moore, were sleeping. Josiah received more blows from the axe than any other victim. His face had been beaten to such an extent that his eyes were missing. The ceiling of the room also had gouge marks from where the murderer lifted the axe to bring it down over and over. The killer used the blade of the axe on Sarah, while using the blunt end on the rest of the victims. The Moore children were the next in line to be bludgeoned in the head in the same manner as their parents. Afterwards, the murderer returned to the master bedroom to inflict more blows on the elder Moores, knocking over a shoe that had been filled with blood before moving downstairs to the guest bedroom and killing Ina and Lena. After the search, police allowed other people into the crime scene to judge their reactions to see if they could have committed the crime, in doing so completely contaminating the weapon. It was also discovered that all of the victims except for Lena Stillinger had been asleep while murdered. She was found laying crosswise on the bed and with defensive wounds on her arms. Lena's nightgown was pushed up to her waist and she was wearing no undergarments, leading law enforcement to believe that the killer sexually molested her. Over time, many possible suspects emerged, including Reverend George Kelly, Frank F. Jones, and William Mansfield, among others. Kelly was tried twice for the murder. The first trial ended in a hung jury, while the second ended in an acquittal. Other suspects in the investigation were also exonerated. Reverend George Kelly was an English-born traveling minister who was in town on the night of the murders. Kelly was described as peculiar, reportedly having suffered a mental breakdown in his adolescence. As an adult, he was accused of peeping into children's windows and several times asking young girls to pose nude for him. On June 8, 1912, he came to Villisca to teach at the Children's Day services, which the Moores family attended on June 9, 1912. He left town between 5 a.m. and 5:50 a.m. on June 10, 1912, hours before the bodies were discovered. Reverend Kelly had confessed to the murders in court, but the jury didn't believe his confession as he was a man of the cloth. In the weeks that followed, he displayed a fascination with the case and wrote many letters to the police, investigators, and families of the deceased. This aroused suspicion, and to cause a private investigator to write back to Reverend Kelly, asking for details that the minister might know about the murders. Kelly replied with great detail, claiming to have heard sounds and possibly witnessed the murders. Because of his mental illness, investigators didn't know if he knew details because he committed the murders or he imagined it because of the investigation. In 1914, 2 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested for sending obscene material through the mail. He was sexually harassing a woman who applied for a job as his secretary. He was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the National Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. Investigators speculated once more that Kelly could be the murderer of the Moore family. In 1917, Kelly was arrested for the Moore murders. Police obtained a confession from him. However, it followed many hours of interrogation, and Kelly later recanted. After 2 separate trials, he was acquitted. Frank Fernando Jones was a Villisca resident as well as an Iowa state senator. Josiah Moore had worked for Frank Jones at his implement store for many years before leaving to open his own store. In doing so, Moore reportedly took business away from Jones, including a very successful John Deere dealership. It was also rumored that Josiah had a sexual affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. William Mansfield. Another theory was that Senator Jones hired William Blackie Mansfield to murder the Moores family. 9 months before the murders in Villisca, a similar case of axe murder occurred in Colorado Springs, Colorado. 2 more axe murder cases followed in Ellsworth, Kansas, and Puyallow, Kansas. The cases were similar enough to raise the possibility of having been committed by the same person. Other murders reported as possibly being linked to those crimes included the numerous unsolved axe murders along the Southern Pacific Railroad from 1911 to 1912. The unsolved Axeman of New Orleans killing, as well as several other murders during the time period. The murders in Colorado Springs were closely related in execution to those of the Moore house. H.C. Wayne, his wife and child, and Mrs. A.J. Burnham were found dead, murdered with an axe. During those murders, bedsheets were used to cover the windows to prevent passerbys from looking in. At the Moore house, the murderer hung aprons and skirts over the windows. As in the murders in Villisca, the murderer in Colorado Springs wiped the blood off his axe and covered the head of the victims with a bedcloth. Mansfield was also the prime suspect of the Burns Detective Agency of Kansas City and Detective James Newton Wilkinson, who suggested that he was a cocaine-addicted serial killer. Detective Wilkinson believed that Mansfield was responsible for the axe murders committed in Puyallow, Kansas, 4 days before the Villisca murders, as well as the murders of Jenny Peterson and Jenny Miller in Aurora, Illinois, along with the axe murders of his wife, infant child, father-in-law, and mother-in-law in Blue Island, Illinois, which was committed on July 5, 1914, 2 years after the Villisca murders. According to the investigation, all of the murders were committed in precisely the same manner, indicating that the same man committed them. The detective also stated that he could prove that Mansfield was present in each of the different crime scenes on the night of the murders. In each murder, the victims were hacked to death with an axe and the mirrors and windows of the homes were covered. A burning lamp with the chimney off was left at the foot of the bed, and the basin in which the murderer washed was found in the kitchen. In each case, the murderer avoided leaving fingerprints by wearing gloves, which they believed was strong evidence that the man was Mansfield, because he knew his fingerprints were on file with the federal military prison in Leavenworth. Wilkerson managed to convince the grand jury to open an investigation in 1916, and Mansfield was arrested and brought to Montgomery County from Kansas City. Payroll records, however, provided an alibi and placed Mansfield in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. He was released for lack of evidence, and later won a lawsuit he brought against Wilkerson, and was awarded $2,225. Wilkerson believed the pressure from Jones resulted not only in Mansfield's release, but also the arrest and trial of Reverend Kelly. However, R.H. Thorpe, a restaurant owner from Shinedo, Ohio, identified Mansfield as a man he saw the morning after the Villisca murders boarding a train in Clarita. This man said he was walking from Villisca. If proven to be true, this testimony would have disproven Mansfield's alibi. The case remains unsolved.